The chair scraped back so fast it left a black mark on the tile. I've worked with post-acute PSY patients for 11 years. Dr. Simone Akers said it the way people say things when they want the sentence itself to be a door closing. I've worked with veterans. I've worked with professional athletes. I've worked with a man who was told he would never hold a pen again, and I sat with him while he finished his doctoral thesis in longhand. She stopped, picked up her bag. I cannot help someone who has decided to be unreachable. The door to the executive suite opened. The door closed. Her footsteps crossed the lobby. The elevator chimed. Then, nothing. Serena Voss sat in the dark office and looked at the window. 41 floors. Portland was laid out below her like a circuit board, lit and running, and entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. A mop handle knocked the hallway floor outside. A knock at the door. A man's voice, low and unhurried. "Sorry to interrupt. I can come back later if come in," Serena said. "There's something near the far wall. An overturned glass. Clean whatever else needs cleaning." He came in. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at her wheelchair with the particular sidelong concern she had learned to identify from across a room. He glanced at the glass, walked to it, crouched without hurry, and cleaned it up. He didn't say anything about the glass or how it had gotten there or what it said about the evening she'd had. He just worked. That was the night everything started. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't. If you've ever been the person who stayed when everyone else walked out, hit subscribe before we go any further. You already know what kind of story this is. You know it costs something to be that person. Let's go back to the beginning. Serena Voss had been CEO of Voss Meridian Group for 9 years before the accident. If you looked her up, and many people had, in the months since, in the specific way people look up someone whose life has become a cautionary footnote in their industry, you'd find the official biography first. Portland-born, Emba from Wharton. Founded Voss Meridian at 32 with a single regional distribution contract and $42,000 in startup capital, half of which was a personal loan from her mother that she repaid in full within 14 months. By year 4, they were operating in 7 states. By year 8, they had appeared on Inc.'s fastest-growing companies list for the second consecutive time. She'd built a company that moved things. Freight, medical supplies, industrial components, the unsexy, load-bearing infrastructure of a functioning economy. She was not famous in the way tech founders were famous. She was respected in the way engineers are respected. Quietly, specifically, by people who understood what the work required. She was also, as anyone who had ever worked in the Voss Meridian executive suite could tell you without being asked, the kind of person who never sat still long enough to be studied. She walked fast. She talked faster. She had standing meetings, because she believed that chairs made decisions lazy. She could read a quarterly projection and find the single offline within 30 seconds. She once rewrote an entire vendor contract at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday because she'd been on a call with a client in Singapore and heard something in the phrasing that didn't sit right, and by the time her team arrived the following morning, there was a revised version in everyone's inbox and a handwritten note, actual pen on actual paper, that said, "The old version assumed we had less leverage than we do. We don't." That was Serena Voss before the accident. The accident was 18 months ago, a Thursday in October. She had been driving back from a site visit in Salem. She drove herself. Always, because she used the commute time to think, and a southbound vehicle crossed the median line on the Morrison Bridge. Wet pavement. Low visibility. The kind of confluence of ordinary factors that compounds into something extraordinary in less than 2 seconds. The other driver walked away. Serena did not technically walk anywhere after that. T6 incomplete spinal cord injury. That was the medical designation. Incomplete meant there was still some signal, some ghost of transmission, between her brain and the lower half of her body. It did not mean she could feel her legs with any reliability. It did not mean she could stand without assistance. What it meant, in clinical language that she'd read so many times she could have recited it backward, was that somewhere in the severed conversation between her nervous system and her limbs, a few telephone lines were still technically connected. They just weren't carrying anything useful yet. She had been told by no fewer than 4 physicians and 3 rehabilitation specialists that with sustained, committed, intensive physical therapy, there was a meaningful possibility of partial motor recovery. The nerve pathways were not completely destroyed. There was biology on her side, if she worked with it. She had heard this. She had processed it. She had then proceeded, methodically and without drama, to make herself the most difficult patient in the Pacific Northwest. The first therapist was Dr. Wendy Farrow, who came highly recommended and arrived at their first session with the bright, organized optimism of someone who has never encountered a patient she couldn't reach. She had 3 certifications mounted on her office wall and a protocol that she described in their intake meeting as evidence-based and patient-centered. And she said both of those phrases without a flicker of awareness that for Serena Voss, the words patient-centered raised an immediate question about who was defining the center, and based on what authority. Farrow lasted 3 weeks. The formal discharge note said patient non-compliance. The actual breaking point, as Serena had later heard through Helen Marsh, who had it from someone tangential to Farrow's practice, was more specific than that. Serena had spent the second week conducting a point-by-point deconstruction of Farrow's methodology during every session, citing research papers she had read between appointments. And by the third week, she had essentially been running the sessions herself and telling Farrow when the protocol was generating suboptimal outcomes. Farrow had written in her notes, "Patient presents with insight into clinical process that exceeds healthy therapeutic boundaries. Unable to establish necessary trust architecture." The actual observation, attributed to an overheard hallway conversation between Farrow and her assistant, was this: "She's not refusing to get better. She's refusing to believe she deserves to." Serena had read this through Helen and had felt nothing she was willing to look at directly. The second therapist was Dr. Joel Crane, a former military rehabilitation specialist who had the grounded, anchored calm of someone who had seen worse and who described his approach, in their first session, not as evidence-based and patient-centered, but simply as, "We work with what's there and we don't pretend what isn't." Serena had appreciated this enormously and had told him so. He lasted 6 weeks. The breaking point with Dr. Crane came on a Friday afternoon. She had been in the middle of a session, actively in the middle, making actual measurable progress on a targeted response sequence that he'd spent 2 weeks establishing, when her phone buzzed with an email from Patrick Hale. Subject line: Transition Support Framework, 4-year review. She had looked at the subject line for 3 seconds. She said, very quietly, "That's enough for today." Doctor, Crane said they had 20 minutes remaining. She threw a glass of water at the wall beside him, not at him, deliberately beside him, close enough that he heard it, far enough that it required no evasion, and said, "We don't." He did not come back. The third therapist was Dr. Simone Akers, and the choice of Akers was the first time Serena had done something that looked, from the outside, like trying. She had found Akers herself, not through a referral, through research. She had spent a weekend reading Akers' published clinical papers, which were precise and unsentimentalized, and demonstrated a specific kind of rigor that Serena recognized as the rigor of someone who had been wrong enough times to stop being confident about things she didn't know. She had thought, privately, in the small hours of a night when she couldn't sleep, that this one might be different. Akers lasted 11 weeks. The night she left, the chair scraping back, the bag picked up, the word she chose on the way out the door, was the night Marcus Delane arrived on the 41st floor. But we'll get to him. Let's talk about the office first, because the office matters. Serena had returned to the building 3 months after the accident, earlier than her doctors had advised, earlier than the board had expected. She had come back because the alternative, sitting in the West Hills house with its suddenly relevant accessibility modifications and its view of the city she had built a company in, felt like a particular kind of defeat that she was not willing to give a name to by inhabiting it. She had the executive suite modified. She did this with a memo, 3 pages, single-spaced, itemized, that read less like an accommodation request and more like a site specification. She was specific about every change and the reasoning behind each one, because she had learned in 18 months that vague requests produced vague results and vague accessibility modifications produced obstacles with softer edges. The conference table lowered 18 inches. The door thresholds widened. The coffee station repositioned to eliminate the awkward reach over the corner cabinet. The whiteboard dropped. 2 of her 3 monitors repositioned. The bathroom door, the one that opened inward, reversed on its hinges, because a door that opened inward in a chair required a backward maneuver that she was not going to execute 3 times a day in front of her executive team. She had submitted this memo to the facilities director, and it had been routed to his team, and most of it had been executed correctly. Most of it. The cord on the desk lamp had not been addressed. It was routed from the wrong side of the desk, and when she maneuvered her chair close enough to work, it sometimes caught on the armrest with a small routine drag that meant nothing to anyone except her, where it meant, the person who modified this room thought about your needs in general and not in particular. She had noted this and said nothing, because she was choosing her battles, and the battles she was choosing were much larger. Patrick Hale. He had been COO of Voss Meridian for 4 years. He was good at his job in the specific way that produces both effectiveness and danger. He was precise, process-oriented, and he moved through organizations the way water moved through landscapes, finding the low places, applying pressure incrementally, never doing anything dramatic enough to be named directly. He had done nothing overtly inappropriate since the accident. He had sent flowers the week she was hospitalized, calla lilies, which she'd noted as an interesting choice, the kind of flower people send when they're trying to convey something clean and formal. He had forwarded relevant documents without excessive commentary. He had shown up to every board call since her return and spoken of her recovery with the measured, appropriate optimism of someone who wanted the record to show he'd been supportive. He had also, in the 3 months since her return, begun CCing board members on operational emails that should have been internal only. He had restructured 2 direct reporting lines, citing operational efficiency during a dynamic period. He had used the phrase during the transition period in a client-facing presentation that Serena had not been shown before it went out. He had not done anything she could fire him for. He had done something more sophisticated. He had made himself necessary. He had positioned himself carefully as the person the board went to when something needed a decision and they weren't sure Serena was. And the word they used was available. But what they meant was something more corrosive than that. Something about reliability. Something about whether the CEO of Voss Meridian was the same person she'd been before the bridge. Helen Marsh, board member, 12-year Voss Meridian veteran, the person who had backed Serena's early expansion into the East Coast market when 3 other board members had called it premature, had told her 6 weeks into the return that 3 board members had already been in private conversations with Patrick. Not formal conversations. Not agended. Just conversations of the kind that happen when 2 people with reason to know each other happen to be at the same industry dinner, and one of them is a COO who manages things smoothly, and the other holds votes on questions of leadership continuity. Serena had received this information, said, "Thank you, Helen," and done nothing visible for the rest of that afternoon. What she had actually been doing was looking at the sketch. The sketch. It was propped against the wall behind her secondary monitor. Not hung, leaning against the paint at a slight angle, facing the room, positioned in the particular way that objects are positioned when you haven't decided whether you're keeping them. It was an architectural sketch, hand-drawn by her in a rehabilitation facility in the weeks immediately following the accident. She had asked for drafting paper and a set of pencils during the 2nd week of her inpatient stay, not because drawing was a comfort she'd developed, but because she'd needed to do something that used her hands and engaged the part of her brain that actually processed things. And lying in a hospital bed thinking in the abstract felt like a resource leak. She had drawn what she'd been developing, in her private time, for 2 years before the accident. A mixed-use development. Retail, residential, community space. It would have looked, in its preliminary schematic, like dozens of other mid-scale urban development projects, except for the thing that made it hers. The accessibility was designed in from the foundation, not retrofitted, not code-compliant minimums, not the ramp at the side entrance, not the elevator positioned wherever it fit after the rest of the building was already determined. The building was structured from its first load-bearing line to be fully, genuinely usable by everyone who might want to be in it. She had been developing this for 2 reasons. Because she believed the design problem was solvable in ways the industry hadn't tried, and because it was going to be the next thing. After Voss Meridian reached the point of stable self-perpetuation, which it was approaching, had been approaching for a year, she was going to do this. She had the capital. She had the industry relationships. She had the eye for the problem. It was going to be hers in a way that Voss Meridian, which had become its own organism and no longer really needed her to survive, was no longer entirely hers. In the rehabilitation facility, she had completed the schematic. It was good. She knew it was good the way she knew things, not from ego, but from pattern recognition. It was precise, it was thoughtful, it resolved design problems she had spent years identifying. The corridor widths, the elevator placement, the wayfinding logic, the door hardware, the materials, all of it assumed a body that moved through space with full ranges of need. All of it worked. The day Dr. Wendy Farrow submitted her discharge note, Serena turned the sketch to face the wall. 4 days later, she turned it back around. She wasn't entirely sure why. It had been facing the room since then, not hung, at an angle against the paint. She had not touched it in weeks. She had not looked at it directly in longer than she could remember. It was just there. Present in the room the way things are present when you've decided you're not going to decide about them yet. Marcus Delane. He was 36 years old, and he'd been working the evening facility shift at Voss Meridian headquarters for 14 months when the night with Akers happened. He'd taken the job the same way he'd taken all the decisions in the 3 years since Rosa died, by running the math on what Owen needed and building outward from there. Owen was 8. He started school at 7:45. He was not a child who slept well, unless Marcus was home when he woke from the occasional bad dream. Not every night, not most nights, but the nights it happened required a parent present. And Marcus was not going to outsource that. The evening shift started at 3 in the afternoon. It paid enough. It had benefits that mattered. Vision, dental, a medical plan with a specialist coverage tier that had mattered more than once in the past 3 years. And the start time meant that every morning, without exception, Marcus could take Owen to school, wait at the gate until Owen was through the doors, and drive away knowing that the morning had been handled by a person who loved him. He had a degree in civil engineering he'd finished 2 years after Owen was born, taking night courses while Rosa was working and Owen was a toddler. Before the facilities job, he'd been a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company, then a crew lead. He was good at the structural and spatial dimensions of built environments in the particular way that makes a person both a good facilities engineer and someone who sees things others don't register. Load paths, sight lines, traffic flow, the places where a building tells you it wants to fail. He pushed a cart. He carried a checklist. He replaced fluorescent tubes and recalibrated motion sensors and cleaned executive conference rooms and cleared floor drains and responded, without commentary, to whatever the building needed on a given evening. He was excellent at it. Not in the way that earns recognition, but in the way that means things work. Facilities is the kind of job where excellence is invisible. The only time anyone notices is when something fails. Marcus Delane was the reason nothing failed. He had a neighbor named Darius Cole, retired electrician, 3 grown children, a flexible schedule, and the particular settled warmth of a man who has decided exactly what matters to him and isn't confused about it. Darius lived 2 doors down, and he'd told Marcus, within a month of Rosa dying, without being asked, "Night shift belongs to me. You go do your thing." He'd meant it. He still meant it. On the evenings when Darius was available, which was most evenings, Marcus could stay in the building until the work was done rather than watching the clock. On the evenings Darius had a prior commitment, Marcus was home by 9. He had not told Serena Voss any of this. They had, in 14 months of occupying the same building, intersected the way people at different levels of large organizations intersect. Briefly, incidentally, neither of them the point of the other's attention. She would be in the hallway with her phone or her notes. He would have a cart. A nod. Her focus already elsewhere. Until the night he knocked on the door of her dark executive office and she said, "Come in," and he came in and saw the glass by the far wall and cleaned it up without asking. At the door, on the way out, he said, "Same time tomorrow?" She said, "What?" He said, I'm on this floor every evening. If you're going to be working late, I'll knock first. She looked at him. You don't need to knock. He said, I'll knock anyway, and left. He did. He knocked every evening for the next 4 months. The pattern established itself without negotiation. Marcus arrived on the 41st floor between 5:40 and 6 o'clock. He knocked, one knock, not two, and waited a single beat before entering. If she was on a call, he backed out and returned in 20 minutes. If she wasn't, he worked. He cleaned in a particular order, the problem areas first, then the routine checks, then anything specific to that day's use of the room. He did not hover. He did not make small talk that wasn't necessary. He moved through the space with the efficient attention of someone who reads a room structurally. What does this space require right now, and what can be made better for tomorrow? And he did what was needed and left. What changed over the first 3 weeks was that he started making modifications. Not modifications she'd requested, modifications that were just correct. The cord on the desk lamp, in the first week, he rerouted it from the left side of the desk, where it caught on the armrest, to behind the desk leg and up the right, where it didn't. He didn't say he'd done it. She noticed the absence of the catch and said nothing. The whiteboard, 2 inches too high for her to comfortably reach the top third, was lowered one Thursday. He'd done it between the end of his other floors and the start of 41. When she wasn't in the room, it was done before she arrived the next morning. The secondary monitor on the right side of her desk had been positioned at an angle that required her to turn more than necessary. One evening, while she was on a call and facing away, he adjusted it 4 degrees. He checked her adjustment the following night and nudged it 2 more. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it until the end of the 3rd week. When she looked up from her monitor as he was checking the condition of the window latches and said, "How long have you been doing this?" He said, "The windows? They stick in cold weather. I like to get ahead of it." "The job," she said. "Here, 14 months, plus a few weeks." She looked at him. "You cover 40, 41, and 42. "Yes, 42 is storage. 40 is easier. You spend more time up here than the footprint requires." He moved to the next window. 41 has more going on, he said. She went back to her monitor. Then, Serena. He looked up. "Not Miss Voss," she said. "Serena," he nodded once. "Good night, Serena," he left. And after that it was Serena. The ghost sensations in her right leg had been happening since 6 weeks after the accident. She had not told anyone. This was not avoidance in the ordinary sense. Serena Voss was not a person who avoided things. She was a person who chose when and how to engage with things, which was a different posture. She engaged with the accident's physical realities directly, clinically, in the language of psi research that she had read more of than most rehabilitation specialists. She was not in denial about what had happened to her body. She understood the injury precisely. The sensations were something else. They arrived 2 to 4 nights a week, usually when she was sitting still and the building had gone quiet. A sensation in the right leg she could only describe as static. Not pain, not pressure, but the ghost of presence. The echo of a leg that was still there, but no longer responding to instruction. It lasted between 30 seconds and 4 minutes. It came without warning and left the same way. She had read enough to know that sensory phenomena and incomplete psi were not unusual and not necessarily indicative of motor recovery potential. A damaged nervous system could produce noise. Noise wasn't signal. It didn't mean anything recoverable. She told herself this while the static came and went, and she sat in her office at 10 at night with Portland spread out below her. The reason she hadn't told Dr. Farrow was that she hadn't trusted Farrow enough within the 3 weeks they'd had. The reason she hadn't told Dr. Crane was that the email from Patrick had arrived during the session when she might have found the words, and then the glass had been thrown, and then he was gone. The reason she hadn't told Dr. Akers, and this was the thought she turned away from most quickly when it surfaced, was that she was afraid Akers would confirm the sensations were significant, and then she would have to decide whether to believe in them. And she did not currently have the resources to make that decision. To decide to believe in something and then have it taken away required a particular reserve of emotional capital that she had not been able to locate in herself since the accident. She was afraid that if she hoped, and the hope turned out to be noise and not signal, she would not be able to rebuild afterward. So she did not tell anyone about the sensations. She sat with them in the quiet of her office, and she noted them the way she noted everything, precisely without interpretation, and she told no one. Patrick Hale was careful. The word that kept appearing in Serena's mind when she analyzed his moves was not aggressive or ambitious. It was careful. He did not move in straight lines. He found the low places, waited for pressure to accumulate, and was never doing anything dramatic enough to address directly. The emails with board members CC'd continued. 3 in the first month of her return, 5 in the second, 8 in the third. Always with some operational rationale attached. Keeping the board informed during a period of transition was a phrase that appeared verbatim in 2 of them. The phrase was elegant in the way that certain traps are elegant. It made the activity seem like governance while doing the work of something else entirely. The restructured reporting lines had been explained in a memo that Serena had received after the restructuring had already been implemented. A sequencing she noted with the particular cold focus she reserved for things she was going to be very angry about later, when she could afford to be angry. He had used the phrase transition planning in a client presentation. He had told a board member, this through Helen, through the particular intelligence network that Helen maintained without appearing to maintain it, that Serena was experiencing significant fatigue related to her ongoing rehabilitation. Serena was not in rehabilitation. She was not experiencing fatigue. She was working 14-hour days and sleeping 5 hours a night and running a company with one hand while she held off a quiet coup with the other. When Helen forwarded her this information, Serena had read it, put her phone face down, picked it up, read it again, and then sat for a very long time without doing anything that could be observed. Marcus had arrived that evening to find her in the dark. He had come in, done the room, and on the way out said, "The projector in Conference A is running a color drift. You'll want it corrected before any presentations." She had looked up. "How do you know about presentations?" "Building calendar," he said. "I check it so I know what needs to be ready." She had looked at him. He had looked back, patient, undefended, holding his clipboard. "Fix it," she said. "Already scheduled." He left. The next morning there was a sticky note on the Conference A door. "Calibration fixed. Notify me if it drifts again. M." She had taken the note into her office and put it in the right-hand drawer of her desk. She wasn't sure why. She didn't examine the why. She put it in the drawer and went back to work. Darius Cole came up exactly once in conversation between them, and that was by accident. Marcus had been on his equipment log. Sitting in the small chair he had eventually moved into the far corner of her office, she had stopped objecting to the chair, which meant she had stopped asking him to leave. Which meant she had stopped pretending she didn't want him there, and his phone had buzzed and he'd glanced at it and said, "With the brief practical quality of a man reporting a weather change, Darius is running late. I'll need to leave by 8:30 tonight." She had been reading a quarterly projection. She said, without looking up, "Who's Darius?" "My neighbor. He stays with Owen on evenings I work late." She turned a page. "Owen goes to bed at 8:30? 8. He wakes up if I'm not home when he has a bad dream." She said, "How often?" He considered. "Used to be every other night. Now maybe once a week. Less than it was." She looked up at that. She didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at his log. She said, "Does he know? About her?" "Rosa." He said the name the same way he always said it, carefully, like a thing he handled with both hands. "Yeah, we talk about her. Probably more than most people are comfortable with." He looked up, and something small shifted in his face. Not discomfort, something closer to rueful recognition. "He asked me last week what her favorite song was." "What did you tell him?" "Aretha Franklin. Natural Woman. She used to sing it off-key while she cooked and pretend she wasn't." Serena was quiet. Then, did he know her well enough to remember? He was 5 when she died. He has some things, specific moments, specific sounds, but mostly he remembers through me. I tell him, so he has it. He paused. "I think that's the right call, but I never know for sure." She went back to her projection. He went back to his log. But the room was different after that. The particular way rooms change when something real has been said in them, and both people in them know it. She did not say anything about her own situation. She had not told Marcus about the accident in any detail. He knew she was the CEO, he knew she was in a wheelchair, he knew something had happened. He had not asked beyond what she offered, and she had offered almost nothing. She was aware this was an asymmetry. She was not sure what to do with it. She started staying later because going home had become something she needed to build up to. It wasn't the drive. She had adapted to the hand controls months ago and drove without thinking about them. It was the house. The house in the West Hills was large and well-positioned, and it had been modified by a contractor who had done a thorough, slightly impersonal job, the right widths, the correct heights, the bathroom hardware replaced with the appropriate lever-style handles, the threshold strips removed. The modification said, "A disabled person lives here." They did not say, "Serena Voss lives here." She had not, before the accident, spent much time at home. The apartment before had been a good place to sleep and think before going back to the office. She had not been sentimental about domestic spaces. Now the spaces felt different, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She would come home at 7, and the silence would be large in a way that working late on the 41st floor prevented. So she stayed. She worked until 9 or 10. On some nights she worked until 11, and on other nights she sat without working, just sat in the lit office while the rest of the floor went dark around her, and looked at Portland through the glass, and let the hum of the building be company. Marcus was always there. He had told her in the first week that his building calendar extended to 11 on weeknights. He finished 40 and 42 and came back to 41. If she was still there, he did a second pass, not because the room needed it, but because he understood, without her having to explain it, that this was now what 41 was for in the evenings. He restocked the water. He checked the lamp. He noted things she'd want to know. The FAC on the east side is running 2 degrees warm. I'll look at it this week. The elevator nearest your office takes about 4 seconds longer than it should. I have a service call on Thursday. She collected these notes the way she collected useful data, precisely, without showing what she did with it. But she used it. She made decisions about building infrastructure based on what Marcus told her, and she noticed when he was right. And he was always right. Once, late in the second month, she had fallen asleep in her chair. She had not meant to. She'd been reading a contract, and the contract had been dense and the hour had been late. But she had stilled and gone, and she didn't know how long it had been, when she surfaced again in a room where the overhead lights were off, just the desk lamp on, and there was a folded work jacket draped over the back of her chair. Not over her, behind her. Draped carefully over the back of the chair, where it was available if she wanted it, and not presumptuous if she didn't. She heard him in the hall. She called out, "Who turned off the light?" He said from just outside me, "Sorry, you were asleep." She said, "There's a jacket. I'll get it on the way out. You can have it now." He came in, quietly, and took the jacket. He was matter-of-fact about all of it. The darkened room, the sleeping, the jacket, the way he was matter-of-fact about everything. He made nothing of things she didn't invite him to make something of. On the way out, he said, "Good night, Serena." She said thank you. That was the extent of it. She thought about it for 2 days afterward. The lightness of it. The fact that he had turned off the light to let her sleep and sat where he could hear her, and had not at any point made anything of any of it. No performance of concern. No commentary. Just the jacket on the back of the chair, available and unpretentious. She had spent 18 months drowning in other people making things of everything. The email from Patrick came on a Wednesday evening in November. Subject: Operational Continuity Framework, Board Discussion. She read it at 6:15, then read it again, then put her phone face down on the desk. She picked it back up and read it a third time. It was a formal proposal, 22 pages, with footnotes and an appendix. It used phrases like support infrastructure for sustained leadership effectiveness and transitional co-leadership model, and ensuring organizational resilience through a defined governance review period. Each sentence, examined alone, was deniable. In sequence, they said one clear thing. I am moving you out of your own company. The proposal called for a 90-day governance review, during which Patrick would serve as interim co-lead, a title that did not exist in any of Voss Meridian's governing documents. At the end of 90 days, the full board would vote on the permanent leadership structure. He had not CC'd her on the distribution. She had received it because Helen Marsh had forwarded it within 17 minutes of it going out, with one line of her own, "I'll vote no, but you need to move fast." She put the phone down. The sketch was against the wall behind her monitor. At its angle, not hung. She sat for a very long time. Marcus arrived at 5:58. She told him what had happened without deciding to. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "How many votes do you have?" She said 3 for certain. 3 for him. 2 I don't know. When does it go to the board? 10 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from the building before then? She almost said something. She didn't. But she looked at him across the lit office and felt the particular rearrangement that happens when you realize you've been thinking of someone in one frame and the frame is wrong. She said, "The conference A projector. And the room needs to be right for a long session. I'll send you the spec." He said, "I'll have it ready." He left. She looked at the sketch. She did not move toward it that night. The 2 votes she didn't know were James Whitfield and Carol Sang. She knew Whitfield, had known him for 9 years, had put him on the board in the company's 3rd year because he understood industrial distribution in a way that most board members didn't, and because he asked the questions in meetings that made the other board members think they should have asked them first. She had thought of him as a structural ally, which was different from a personal one, a professional relationship of mutual respect and aligned incentives. She learned from Helen, on the Thursday of that first week, that Whitfield had had dinner with Patrick in mid-October. He had not mentioned this to her. He had not mentioned it to Helen, either. Helen had learned it from the restaurant, which was the kind of restaurant that industry people talked about going to. It was a social credential, being seen there, and where people noticed who was dining with whom. The particular heard of it, and she sat with this only briefly, because she found the sentiment unproductive in the time frame she was operating in, was not that Whitfield was considering backing Patrick. It was that he hadn't told her. 9 years. He hadn't said, "Serena, I'm having concerns about your capacity to lead. I want you to know that before someone else does." He had had dinner with Patrick and said nothing. She understood why. She understood the calculation. What she had not understood, until that moment, was how completely her situation had changed the rules of what people would do. Before the accident, no one in her professional orbit would have considered a private dinner with her COO without telling her about it, because the cost of her finding out would have been too high. She would have found out. She always found out. And the finding out would have consequences. That was the deterrence architecture of her professional relationships, and it had functioned well for 9 years. The accident had changed her situation in ways that the paperwork and the board accommodations and the careful language about recovery and support had obscured. People no longer believed the cost of disloyalty was real. The deterrence was gone. The leverage had shifted. She sat with this for an evening, and then she moved. Helen told her, on the Friday of the first week, that Carol Sang was on the fence. "She's not with Patrick," Helen said. "But she's not with you either. She's asking questions about operational continuity in the next 18 months, and she's not satisfied with the answers she's been getting." Serena said, "What answers has she been getting?" "Patrick's," Helen said, which explained everything. She called Carol Sang directly that afternoon. Not through an intermediary, not through Helen, directly, on Carol's cell phone, at 4 in the afternoon. Carol picked up on the second ring. Serena said, "I know Patrick has been talking to you. I know you have questions. I'd like to answer them myself." There was a pause. Then Carol said, "I wasn't expecting this call." "I know," Serena said. "I should have called 3 weeks ago. That's on me." She spent 45 minutes on the phone with Carol Sang. She answered every question directly, about operational capacity, about the governance review timeline, about what Voss Meridian's strategy looked like in the 18 months beyond the current period. She did not manage Carol. She did not perform confidence she didn't have. She was specific and honest, and when Carol asked whether she was considering any kind of expanded leadership structure, Serena said, "No. But I'm working on something that will make that question irrelevant. I need 10 more days." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 10 days. "Yes. Send me something concrete before the board meeting." "I will," Serena said, and hung up. She had nothing concrete yet. She had 10 days to build it. She pulled the sketch out from behind the monitor and put it in her lap and looked at it for the first time since the hospital. 6 days before the board meeting, Marcus arrived at 5:54. One knock. "Come in," she said. He could tell before he was fully through the door. Not that something was wrong, something was different. She was sitting a half-turn away from the desk, facing the window rather than her monitors. Her laptop was closed. Serena Voss did not close her laptop while she was in the office. He started his circuit without speaking. Checked the water, checked the lamp, moved the recycling bin back into position. Cleaned the coffee station. All quiet. She said, without turning, the projector in Conference A. "Checked it this morning," he said. "It's holding calibration." Good, she was still at the window. Portland at evening, the bridges bone pale across the Willamette, the sky going steel gray from the west, the way it did most evenings this time of year. "The board meeting is in 6 days." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. He finished the circuit and moved toward the door. "Marcus," he stopped. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough to address the room rather than the window. "How long does it take to stop being furious that things aren't the way they were?" He didn't answer right away. He came back into the room, not far, stopped near the center, where neither of them had to raise their voice. He said, "I'll let you know when I get there." She looked at him. He said it as a fact, not a performance, not inspirational, not reassuring. Just, "I'm still in it too, and I'm still running, and I don't know yet." She turned back to the window. "Rosa," she said. She had never said the name before. He'd told her the name 3 weeks ago, after Owen's visit, and she'd held it without saying it out loud until now. "I know you told me. I just never." She stopped. "I'm sorry. That's what I meant to say." He said, "Yeah," and then, after a breath, 3 years ago. Owen was 5. Does he still ask about her? Different questions every day. Yesterday he wanted to know what her laugh sounded like. He paused. I did an impression. He made me do it 6 times. She let out a breath that was almost a sound of something. Not quite a laugh. Something smaller and more complicated. She said, "What did it sound like?" "Loud," Marcus said. She laughed like she didn't care who heard her. Full sound. Nothing back of the throat about it. Serena was quiet. He said, "Good night, Serena," she said. "Stay a minute." He stopped. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the window, at Portland and its evening arrangement. "I don't need anything. I just don't want the floor to be quiet right now." He said, "Okay." He came back into the room. There was a chair in the far corner, the one he'd moved in 5 weeks ago, but instead of sitting in it, he sat on the floor, back to the side wall, clipboard on his knees. He had done this before in the early weeks, and she'd offered the chair and he'd declined. And after a few times, she'd stopped offering. She'd thought about it after the first time. Why the floor? Then she'd understood. In the chair, he was above her. He hadn't said this. He'd just resolved it, quietly with the floor. She said, "You don't have to. The floor is fine," he said. He opened his log. They sat. The city outside did its evening things. The lights came up on the bridges the way they did every night, programmed and indifferent. She sat with the building quiet around her and Marcus on the floor with his clipboard, and the particular silence that had always existed on this floor with him in it. The silence that was a choice rather than a failure. 7 minutes passed. She knew because she clocked things, not deliberately, just as a function of the way she processed time. In the 8th minute, the ghost sensation appeared in her right leg, the static, the radio signal from a station that might not exist. She noted it and said nothing. He said, "What are you going to give Carol Sang?" She looked at him. He was looking at his log, but he'd said it the way he said things, quietly, directly, as if continuing a conversation they were both already in. Something concrete, she said. I told her I had something in 10 days. I have 6 now. What do you have? She looked at the sketch. It was on the wall now. She'd asked him to hang it the morning after Owen's visit, and he'd come in before his shift and hung it with 2 picture hooks and a level, and it was straight. It had been straight on the wall for 4 days, and she was still not used to it. He followed her gaze to the sketch. He'd been looking at it occasionally. For weeks, she'd caught him looking. In the peripheral way, she caught everything. He'd never said anything about it. Now he looked at it directly. What were you building, he said, before the accident? Something changed in the room. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened in this office when it mattered. She'd noticed this, and she'd found it both unusual and necessary. Things changed quietly, like the desk lamp cord rerouted behind the desk leg, like the whiteboard lowered 2 inches, like a jacket on the back of a chair. That's personal, she said. The automatic response, calibrated and fast. I know, he said. He said it without apology. He was looking at the sketch, and there was no performance in his attention, no strategy, no angle. He was just looking at the thing the way he looked at structural problems, trying to understand what it was and what it needed. She said, a building. He said, okay. She looked at the sketch on the wall. She'd drawn it in pencil on oversized drafting paper. The lines were clean. She had trained herself in basic drafting years ago and had developed her own shorthand for annotation that she'd never bothered to explain to anyone because she hadn't needed to explain it to anyone. It was for her. She said, not for the company. For myself. I'd been planning it for 2 years. What kind? She told him. Mixed use. Retail, residential, community space. She described the accessibility design, the real version, the from first principles version, not the code compliance version, and she watched his face while she talked. The face of someone who had a civil engineering degree and knew how load paths worked and what happened to circulation when you thought about it wrong from the start. He was quiet. He didn't nod to show he was listening. He just listened. She talked for longer than she'd planned to. She talked about the corridor widths and the elevator placement and the floor materials and what the wayfinding logic looked like if you designed it for someone who couldn't read every sign. She talked about the door hardware and the sight lines and the entry sequence, and how most entry sequences were designed by people who assumed you approached at walking speed and adjusted for nothing else. He said nothing until she stopped. Then, why is it on the wall? She looked at him. You just asked me why. 4 days ago it was on the floor, he said. Now it's on the wall. Why did you hang it? She said, Owen. He was quiet. He said the things you make should go on walls, she said. I heard it, and I didn't do anything with it that night. But in the morning, she paused. In the morning I asked you to hang it. He looked at the sketch. Then he said, why was it on the floor in the first place? She looked at him. He said it the same way he said everything. Not aggressive, not clinical. Just direct and quiet and waiting. It was the particular quality she'd been trying to name for weeks. He asked questions the way a building asked questions. Not with agenda. Just with the structural honesty of a thing that doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. She said, because putting it on the wall means I still believe in it. He waited. And I stopped. She stopped herself. Started again. I'm not sure I have the standing to believe in things right now. He said, who told you that? Nobody told me that. Something told you that. She looked at the window. 3 therapists quit. They kept. She stopped. They were trying to help me, and I kept making it impossible. I kept finding reasons why their approach was wrong, why the methodology was flawed, why they didn't understand my specific situation. I was very good at making it impossible. She paused. And then they left. And I told myself they were right to leave, that I was exactly as unreachable as they said. He looked at her. She said, the last one, Akers, she worked with me for 11 weeks, longer than any of them. And the night she left, the night you came in and cleaned the glass, I thought that's the proof. Even the most persistent one couldn't stay. He said, that's not proof of anything about you. She looked at him. It feels like it. I know, he said. That's not the same thing. She was quiet. He said, why did you make it impossible for them? She said, I don't know. The words cost something. She could feel them cost something. She had spent 18 months knowing everything, knowing she was fine, knowing she was functional, knowing the assessments were incomplete, knowing the methodology was flawed, knowing, with the relentless precision of a person who could not afford to not know. And the first thing she'd admitted she didn't know about was this. About herself. About what she'd done and why she'd done it. I don't know. She said it again, quietly, just once. I don't know. He received it the way he received everything in this room, without making it bigger or smaller than it was, without assigning it a meaning she hadn't given it, without doing anything with it at all except hold it in the room with her. After a moment he said, you've been carrying this by yourself for a long time. She said, I'm good at carrying things alone. I know, he said. That's not the same as it being good for you. She looked at him. He looked back. Nothing in his face was asking her to argue with it or agree with it. He'd said a true thing and set it down, and he was just there. She said, quietly, toward the window, I think I was afraid that if I got better and then had to come back to all of this. She stopped. I was afraid it would be worse. To have gotten up and then find out that what I came back to wasn't worth the effort. He said, is it worth it? She looked at the sketch. She said, I'm still trying to figure that out. He said, okay. He picked up his clipboard. He sat with her for another 20 minutes and then he left. And she sat alone in the lit office with the sketch on the wall and the Portland bridges in their bone-white arrangement outside the glass and the static in her right leg coming and going like a radio station trying to reach her from a long way off. The board voted 5-3. Helen called at 7:43. James and Carol both went with Patrick, she said. I'm sorry, Serena. The 90-day governance review is approved. Interim co-lead designation goes into effect Monday. Serena said, I need 10 days. You've got 6. Monday is, I know when Monday is, Helen. She paused. I'll have something for you before then. She hung up and sat in the office until Marcus arrived at 5:59. He came in and saw it in her face before she said anything. She said, 5-3. He said, I know. Grapevine is fast. She almost smiled. It came out as a breath. Carol's song, she said. After 45 minutes on the phone. She told me she'd give me 10 days. He said, she gave you until the vote, which was 6 days after we spoke. She looked at him. I didn't give her anything concrete. I told her I had something and then I didn't produce it in time. He said, do you have something? She looked at the sketch. She said yes. The school had a half day on the second Thursday of December, and Marcus had arranged it with Darius 3 weeks in advance, which was how he arranged everything. Not last minute. Not with the slightly frantic improvisation of a person who is perpetually behind, but with the quiet pre-planning of a man who runs on a mental calendar that accounts for his son's school schedule 6 weeks out, and his building's maintenance windows 2 months out, and the particular way his own emotional resources were distributed at any given time. Darius had an appointment that day, a dental thing, minor, but in the afternoon, which was the wrong side of available. So Marcus had made a different arrangement. He would bring Owen to the building during his afternoon prep hours, from 3 until Darius was back, because the offices above 40 were largely empty before 3:30, and Stan Greaves, the facilities director, operated on his stated management philosophy of noticing only what was broken. Owen had been to the building twice before, on weekend maintenance calls, and had described the elevators as too slow. The water fountain is too low to see into properly, and the view from 41 is very good. He had opinions. Today Owen had his drawing supplies in his backpack and a project in mind, which he described at breakfast with the focused specificity of someone executing a plan. He wanted to draw Portland from up high before the clouds moved in, because the bridges, he had explained, looked different in November than they did in summer, and he wanted to get the November version before it passed. Marcus had not questioned the artistic logic. He had eaten his cereal and said, "We'll need to get to the building by 3. 3:15 is fine," Owen had said, looking at his watch. He had the same watch Marcus wore, not an identical model, just the same style, a detail Owen had arranged himself by asking for it on his birthday last year, and which Marcus wore with the particular low-level constant gratitude that characterized parenthood at its best. He set Owen up at the unused workstation on 40. Clear desk, good window sightline, power outlet for the perpetual charging concern. He left him with his sketch pad and went to do his prep inventory. He was on the HVAC calibration check on 41 in the east corridor when he heard the elevator. He knew Owen's footsteps. He had known them since the months after Rosa died. When Owen would cross the hall to his room in the night to check that Marcus was still there, and the footsteps were different from anyone else's, a particular rhythm, slightly wide-spaced, slightly more deliberate than you'd expect from a small person, as though he was always testing the floor a little before he trusted it. He was already moving before he consciously decided to. He reached the doorway of her office and stopped. Owen was in the middle of the room, sketchpad under his arm, looking at Serena with the direct, estimating look he gave to things he hadn't categorized yet. Serena was at her desk, turned slightly toward him. She'd heard the knock, which meant Owen had knocked, which was a thing Marcus hadn't known his son knew to do in an office building, and which he filed under the category of things Owen did that Rosa would have gotten credit for. "Hi," Owen said. "Hello," said Serena. "I'm Owen. My dad works here. He fixes things." "I know who you are," Serena said. "He's mentioned you." Owen looked interested in this. "What did he say?" "That you draw." He considered this. "I mostly draw buildings," he said, in the tone of someone correcting a minor imprecision. "And bridges. And sometimes forklifts, but that was for a school project and it's different." He looked around the room. He did this methodically the way Marcus did, reading the space rather than just looking at it. He noted the window, the desk, the monitors. He noted the wheelchair with the particular unweight of a child who has already processed that some people move this way and hasn't attached drama to the fact. And then his eyes landed on the sketch. "Is that a building?" he said. "Yes," Serena said. "Did you draw it?" "I did." He walked toward it. He moved with the confidence of someone who has received permission, even though the specific permission for this particular movement had not technically been granted. He stopped in front of it, at his height roughly eye level, and he studied it the way he studied anything that interested him without rushing to an opinion, giving it the full attention it asked for. "The lines are straight," he said approvingly. "I used a ruler for the structural lines. I try to use a ruler, but it always moves." He turned to look at her. "How do you keep it still?" "Hold the pencil at a lower angle, closer to horizontal. Less leverage on the ruler edge." He absorbed this with the serious nod of someone committing a technique to permanent memory. Then he looked back at the sketch. "How many rooms does it have?" "I haven't decided yet. The schematic I did is the structural layout. The rooms get designed later, once the bones are right." "Why do the bones have to come first?" "Because if the bones are wrong, the rooms can't fix it. You can always change a room. You can't easily change a wall that's in the wrong place." He thought about this for a moment. Then, "Is that true for other things too?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly the way Rosa had done when she was working something out. "Like, is it true that if the bones are wrong, you can't fix it from the outside?" Serena said. Sometimes he nodded, like this confirmed a suspicion. He looked back at the sketch. Then, "Why isn't it hanging up?" Marcus took a very quiet breath from the doorway. Serena said, "It is hanging up." Owen looked at the picture hooks, the level straight hang, the way it sat against the wall. "I mean," he said, with the patience of someone who has noticed an adult misunderstanding him, "why wasn't it hanging up before?" "It has marks on the wall from where it was leaning." He pointed. Faint marks in the paint, near the baseboard, where the frame had rested for months. She looked at the marks. Owen said, "My dad says the things you make should go on walls. Otherwise, how do you remember you made them?" Serena looked at him. "He says that? About my drawings. But I think it's true for everything." He looked at the sketch with a final, satisfied look, then at her. "It's a good building. I think you should build it." Marcus stepped into the room. "Owen, you're supposed to be on 40. Owen was unperturbed. "The view is better up here. You can see the bridges and the mountain on the same side." He looked between his father and Serena with the uncensored attention of a child who is watching something he can't fully name but is interested in anyway. Then, directly to Serena, with Rose's precise economical directness, "Your legs don't work." Marcus said, "Owen." Serena said, "It's okay." She looked at Owen. "No, not the way they used to." "Does it hurt?" "Not the way most people think." Owen considered this carefully. The considering had weight. He was not asking from curiosity only. He was asking from the particular seriousness of a child who has had close proximity to the kind of hurt that doesn't show up in obvious places. "My mom hurt in places you couldn't see," he said. Dad said that was the hardest kind, when people couldn't tell by looking. The office held the sentence. Serena looked at Owen. Something moved through her face, not quite grief, not quite recognition, something smaller and more specific. The particular look of someone receiving a sentence they have needed without knowing until the moment they receive it. She said, "What was her name?" "Rosa," Owen said. Marcus said nothing. He hadn't told her Rosa's name. He'd said my wife and she died and 3 years ago, and once Owen was 5. He hadn't said her name. He'd held her name close in the way that people hold the names of people they love most, not as a withholding but as a reservation. A word he still handled with both hands. Owen said it the way children say the names of people they love and can't remember not knowing. Without weight. As a given. Serena said, "Rosa." "Yeah." Owen looked at the sketch one more time. Then, very simply, as if this were the natural conclusion of everything they'd discussed, "I think she would have wanted to live in a building like that. Rosa, if the building could think, I think it would want people like her in it." Marcus looked at the floor. Serena said, "I think you're right." Owen went to the window after that, satisfied with the conversation in the way of children who say exactly what they mean and don't need the aftermath. He set up his sketch pad and began drawing the November version of Portland's bridges, which were, he noted to no one in particular, more bone-colored than the summer ones and worth getting down before the clouds moved in. Marcus started to apologize. Serena said, "Don't." He stopped. She was looking at the sketch on the wall. At the level hang, the picture hooks, the faint marks near the baseboard that showed where it had leaned for too long. "Rosa," she said again, quietly, to herself as much as to him. "Yeah," he said. They were quiet for a while. Owen drew. Portland arranged itself through the glass. That night, after they had gone, Owen presenting her with the bridge drawing on his way out, with the specific brevity of an artist who doesn't over-explain his work, Serena sat alone in the office. She picked up her phone. She called Helen Marsh at 9:47. Helen picked up on the second ring. "I need a board presentation slot," Serena said. 3 weeks from Monday. Helen said, "For what?" "The Meridian Access Initiative. New Development Division of Voss Meridian. I'm building the project I've been developing for 2 years. I have a market thesis, a revenue model, and developer conversations in progress. I'm going to walk Patrick Hale out of a boardroom by making his governance review about nothing." A pause. Helen said 3 weeks. "That's what I have." Helen said, "Then we'd better move fast." She built it in the mornings and afternoons in the office, with the sketch on the wall and Owen's bridge drawing taped beside it. She brought in the data she'd been accumulating for 2 years. Not formally, not in a system, in the way she accumulated research that wasn't yet a project. Saved articles, building codes from 3 states. Developer interviews she'd done under the pretense of industry research, material specs, cost data. She'd been carrying all of it in her head and in a folder on her personal drive, and it came out now with the particular clarity of something that was ready. The market thesis was this: the existing built environment failed a significant and economically meaningful population, not because of malice, but because of perspective. Accessibility design, installed at the end of the building process as a code compliance check, produced bad outcomes. The ramp at the side, entrance. The elevator placed wherever it fit after the floor plan was already set. The bathroom that required a backward maneuver. These were failures of sequencing. They happened because the designer hadn't started from the body that would use the building. An accessibility-first design, starting from the body at the foundation stage, produced a fundamentally different building. Not just a building that worked for disabled users, a building that worked better for everyone. Because the constraints that made it work for the most demanding use cases also made it work better for the ordinary ones. Wider corridors moved more people faster. Lever hardware was easier for everyone. Sensory wayfinding helped lost visitors as much as visually impaired ones. Accessible elevators at traffic flow positions moved the building better. She had the cost data. The delta between accessibility, first new construction, and standard new construction was narrower than the industry assumed, and in several structural categories was actually negative. It cost less, done correctly from the beginning, than the retrofitting costs that accumulated over a building's first decade. She built the revenue model. 3 phases. Phase 1, the original development, the building in the sketch, or the closest real version of it, as the proof of concept and flagship. Phase 2, licensing the design methodology to developers who wanted to access the premium market for accessibility-forward commercial and residential space. Phase 3, a consultancy division that worked with corporate clients on built environment strategy, because ADA compliance was the floor, and increasingly their clients needed ceiling. She had 4 developer conversations already open, 2 in Portland, 1 in Seattle, 1 in Denver, that she'd been having quietly for 6 months, framed as exploratory research. 2 of those had moved to what could be called term sheet discussion if she was willing to call them that. She called Marcus into the modeling sessions. Not officially. There was no HR process for what was happening in the 41st floor office at 9 in the evenings. With Marcus on the floor or in his chair, working through load distribution ratios and the structural mathematics of what happened to floor plate when you designed for wheelchair turning radius from day 1 rather than retrofitting it at the end. He knew things she didn't. The construction side reality of what the numbers she was modeling actually looked like when they became concrete and steel. She knew things he didn't. The financial modeling, the market analysis, the developer relationship landscape. The combination worked. She had known it would work before she asked him. Because she had been watching him for 4 months and she knew the shape of his intelligence. He stayed until 2:30 in the morning on 3 of those nights. He didn't ask to. He just didn't leave. Darius had said he'd cover until whenever, and Marcus worked the way she did, which was to say until the work was done rather than until the clock said otherwise. On the 3rd night, very late, she said, "Your hourly rate does not cover this." He said, "I'm not on the clock." She said, "That's not how compensation works." He said, "I'm aware. I'll send you my consulting rate." He looked up from the floor plate schematic. "I don't have a consulting rate." She said, "You do now, as of tonight. I'm going to need you on this properly if the initiative moves forward." He looked at her. She said, "Director of Structural Integration. It's a role I'm creating for the initiative. I'll have Helen draft the documentation." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I have a facilities job." "I know. This would be in addition to with a pathway to transition, depending on the board vote." He said, "You're confident." She said, "I am now." She said it simply, not as a performance, not as a declaration, just as a fact she had arrived at, quietly, while building the thing that had been sitting on her floor for too long. She called Dr. Patricia Lim on the Thursday of the 2nd week. Lim picked up the phone herself, which she always did, which was one of the reasons Serena had kept her for 7 years. She said, "I have sensory phenomena in my right leg." Silence. When did this start? 6 weeks post-accident. A longer silence. "Serena, that was 18 months ago." "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at the sketch on the wall, at Owen's bridge drawing taped beside it, at the picture hooks that held the sketch straight. "I wasn't ready to find out what it might mean," she said. "What changed?" She said, "Someone asked me why I stopped building things I believed in." Lim said, "That's a good question." "I know," said Serena. "I'm working on the answer." Lim referred her to a neurological rehabilitation specialist at OSU. Ewan Park. Incomplete psi was his specific practice, and what Dr. Lim said about his approach was a single word that she said with particular weight: different. The appointment was in 10 days. Serena made it. She did not cancel it. She told no one she'd made it, not Helen, not Marcus, Not Darius when she crossed paths with him briefly in a parking garage at a conference. Not anyone. She went by herself to a clinic in the South Park blocks on a Thursday morning, drove herself, parked, rolled in. In the waiting room, she sat for 7 minutes before being called. The ghost sensation was present in her right leg the entire time, steady, static, the signal trying to reach her from however far away it was sending from. She sat with it instead of analyzing it. That was different. She was with Dr. Park for 90 minutes. She told him everything. The injury, the timeline, the sensations, the 18 months of nothing, the 3 therapists, the reason she could identify and the reason she couldn't. She told him about the sketch. Not why she mentioned the sketch. It wasn't relevant clinically, but it came out, partway through, and Dr. Park didn't flag it as out of scope. He just listened. When she was done, he said, "The sensory phenomena you're describing are consistent with incomplete T6 presentation and are clinically significant. Not a guarantee, but not nothing." She said, "What does it mean?" "It means the pathways aren't entirely silent. It means the conversation between your nervous system and your lower body is impaired, but not destroyed." He paused. "It means we have something to work with, if you want to work with it." She said, "What does that look like?" He told her. A protocol. An 8-week timeline. Specific exercises targeting specific neural pathways. Weekly appointments. Homework between. A single metric. A motor response to a specific stimulus that would tell them by week 8 whether there was a meaningful pathway to attempt. She said, "I've had 3 therapists quit." He said, "I know. I looked at your chart. I'm not Dr. Farrow, and I'm not Dr. Crane, and I'm not Dr. Akers." He said it without any drama. "My job isn't to tell you what you're capable of. My job is to tell you what the biology has to work with. What you do with that is yours." She sat in the clinic parking garage for a long time after. She thought about the question Marcus had asked her, weeks ago, in the lit office with Portland spread below. Why is it on the floor? She thought, I don't know yet what's going to happen with my legs. And then, I know what I'm building. Both things were true at the same time. She sat with them, both. She drove back to the office and worked until 11. The board presentation was on a Monday. Serena had asked for 90 minutes, more than any single agenda item had received in a board session since the Q4 restructuring 3 years ago. Helen had gotten it scheduled. There had been, she reported, some resistance from Patrick's aligned members. The request seems to presuppose a different governance posture than the current review framework suggests, was how James Whitfield had apparently framed it. In the particular language of someone who has rehearsed his position, and Helen had told them that Serena was presenting something new, something they hadn't seen, and that 90 minutes was what it would take to present it properly. They had relented. They always relented still when it came to that direct. The deterrence architecture still had some life in it. She opened with the sketch. Not a slide, not a rendering, a photograph of the actual drawing scaled to the main display. The pencil lines, the margin annotations, the notes in her handwriting from the hospital in the weeks after the accident. She said, "This is something I've been building for 2 years. I want to show you why it's now a Voss Meridian business." She walked them through the market thesis. She walked them through the cost data. She walked them through the 3-phase model. She showed them the 4 developer conversations, 2 at term sheet discussion. She showed them the structural modeling, the floor plate numbers, the corridor distributions, the cost delta that showed clearly and without argument that this was cheaper to do right from the beginning than to correct afterward. She showed them Owen's drawing. It was in the photograph she had taken the night after his visit, the bridges in blue crayon, the flags at the top of the tallest bridge, taped beside the sketch on her wall. She didn't explain why it was there. She said, "Someone told me that buildings are meant to be lived in, that the things you make should go on walls. I've been developing this for 2 years. I'm ready to build it," Patrick said, with the careful, measured quality of a man repositioning. "The timeline seems aggressive. Given," Serena said. "Given what?" He stopped. "Given the governance review?" she said. "The review was called because of questions about my capacity to lead. I have presented you with a new division, a 3-phase revenue model. a developer pipeline at early term sheet stage, and a structural thesis that no one in this company or our competitor landscape is currently executing. She looked at Patrick. Does this address the capacity question, or is there something else you want to ask me? He said nothing. James Whitfield said, the financial projections on Phase 2 licensing are conservative, Serena said. I modeled them on comparable IP licensing arrangements in adjacent sectors and discounted by 30% for market adoption lag. The assumption is that we'll spend the first 18 months proving the concept before the licensing market opens. If Phase 1 performs at the low end of the range I've given you, Phase 2 will move faster than I've modeled. Whitfield said, Okay. Carol Song said, What do you need from us? Serena said, A vote to close the governance review and full authorization to establish the Meridian Access Initiative as a wholly owned division. And I need to be able to name a director of structural integration who is currently not in a director-level role at Voss Meridian. Carol looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I'll second both. Helen Marsh moved to close the governance review and revoke Patrick's interim co-lead designation. The vote was 6-2. Patrick submitted his resignation 4 days later. Serena received the letter, acknowledged it to HR with a single sentence of professional courtesy, and did not comment on it to anyone. She had never believed in commentary that served no function. Marcus arrived at 5:52 that evening. One knock. She said, Come in. He could see it when he came through the door. Not triumph, something quieter than triumph. The particular state of a person who has done something very difficult and is still inside the doing of it, still absorbing what it cost and what it settled. He started his circuit. He was partway through it when she said, 6-2. He looked up. The vote, she said. 6-2. Governance review closed. Initiative authorized. Patrick's resignation is in. He said, yeah. Building Grapevine. He finished the circuit and didn't leave. She said, I went. He looked at her. To the appointment. The PT appointment. Doctor. Park. I went 3 weeks ago and I didn't tell anyone. She paused. I've been going every Thursday since. He said, I know. She looked at him. How? You come in different on Thursdays. You have since the second week. She looked at him. He was standing near the far wall, holding his clipboard, waiting, not doing anything with the information except having it. She said, different how? Quieter, he said. Not worse quiet. Just, like you've been somewhere that cost something and you haven't processed it yet. She looked at the window, at Portland and its arrangement, at the bridges, bone pale in the winter evening, the way Owen had drawn them. She said, it doesn't get easier. Every week I have to decide again that it's worth it, that it matters enough to try. I thought by now the deciding would be automatic. It isn't. It's just necessary. He said, yeah. She looked at him. Does that get better? He considered. It gets less heavy. But it doesn't go away. You just get better at carrying it without noticing how much it weighs. She said, Rosa. He said, yeah. And other things. He looked at the floor. Then back at her. Owen asked me this morning if you were going to build the building. She said, what did you tell him? I told him yes. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Something small and ordinary and not dressed up in any particular emotion. Just a person receiving a fact that matters to them. She said, he'll like that. He already does, Marcus said. He was quiet for a moment. He drew you into his family portrait, the school project, 3 figures. He paused. He labeled you the lady who hung her building. She looked at the sketch on the wall, at Owen's bridges beside it, at the picture hooks that held it all straight. She said, he can put it on his wall. He already did, Marcus said. He put it on his wall the day he finished it and wouldn't let me move it to the refrigerator. He said refrigerators were for grocery lists. She looked at him. He was almost smiling, not all the way, just the beginning of it, the way a person smiles when they're thinking about someone they love. She said, is Owen's drawing still on your cart? All his drawings are on my cart, he said. I run out of room and tape the new ones over the old ones. She said, can I see them sometime? He looked at her. She was looking at him directly, not as assessment, not as strategy, not with the particular armor that she wore in most professional interactions. Just looking at him. The way a person looks at someone they have been sitting in the dark with for 4 months and want to see in better light. He said, "Sure." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland did. The lights on the bridges came up. The clouds moved in from the west. The building hummed around them with the particular warmth of a structure that is well maintained. She turned back to her monitor. He picked up his clipboard. He said, "On the way to the door, the plaque goes up tomorrow." She looked up. "What plaque?" Helen Marsh submitted the installation order this morning. Meridian Access Initiative, Executive Offices, near the elevator bank. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know she'd done that." "She must have had it ordered before the vote," he said, "or she was very confident." He paused. She was very confident. He left. She sat with that, with Helen's confidence, which was really just the confidence of a person who had known her for 12 years and understood what happened when Serena Voss decided to build something. She sat until 10 o'clock. Then, she drove home. She slept for 8 hours. The following Thursday, she went to her 4th appointment with Dr. Park. At the end of the session, he asked her to attempt a specific motor response, the one he'd told her about in their first meeting, the metric that would tell them in 8 weeks whether there was a pathway. She had been building to it for 3 weeks. She had not told herself it would happen. She had told herself she would try. She tried, and something happened. Not much. Less than a twitch, less than anything a camera would have caught. Something in the territory between signal and noise, at the exact threshold of the distinction. Something where there had been nothing. Dr. Park said, "That's interesting." She said, "What does it mean?" He said, "It means we keep going." She drove to the parking garage and sat in her car for a while. She did not call anyone. She thought about the sketch on the wall. She thought about Owen saying buildings are meant to be lived in. She thought about Marcus on the floor of her office asking why it was on the floor instead. She thought, "I don't know what my legs will do." And then, "I know what I'm building." Both things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. She sat with them both, and they fit. She went home. She slept. Here is what this story isn't. It isn't the story of a woman who needed the right person to get better. Serena did not get better because of Marcus Delane. The appointments with Dr. Park, the decisions on those Thursdays to go back. The attempt in week 4 that produced something in the territory between signal and noise, that was her work, her showing up, her deciding again and again that it mattered enough. He didn't give that to her. He asked a question at the right moment, by someone who wasn't trying to fix her. But the decision to move, the physical work of it, the cellular, daily, costly work of trying, was always and entirely hers. This isn't the story of a man who saved her, either, he would say, if you asked him on a night when he felt like talking, that he didn't do anything in particular. He cleaned what needed cleaning. He noticed what was there. He sat on the floor because that was where he fit. He asked a question because the sketch was on the floor at an angle, and something about it seemed structurally wrong, and he wanted to understand why. He might say, if you pushed him, that it wasn't one-directional. That coming up to 41 every evening, into the lit office, into the particular quiet that Serena Voss made around herself, it had given him something. A place where the silence didn't need to be filled. A place where someone already knew about Rosa, without him having to say her name every time someone new looked at his ring. A place where he could sit on the floor with his clipboard and feel, at some distance he couldn't easily name, the presence of a person who took things seriously. He wasn't used to being in the company of someone who took things seriously the way he did. Owen drew the 3 of them into his family portrait 6 months after the board meeting. The school project kind, 1 page, 3 figures, labeled in his handwriting, Dad. Me, the lady who hung her building. Serena was drawn with both arms wide, the sketch visible behind her on its wall. The bridges in the background through a large window. She had all her usual lines and she was standing. Owen did not know, when he drew her standing, that he was drawing something that hadn't happened yet. He taped it to the supply cart. What the sketch represents is not what it is. It's easy to look at an architectural drawing of a mixed-use, accessibility-first development and see a business plan, which it is, or a passion project, which it also is, or evidence of professional capacity, which it additionally is. Those things are all true. But what the sketch on the wall means, the one she drew in a hospital bed in the weeks after the accident, when she still believed she was building toward something, the one she turned to face the wall the day the first therapist quit, the one she turned back around without knowing why, the one that leaned at an angle against the paint for months, not hung, not discarded, not quite either thing. What the sketch represents is the part of her she didn't let go of, even when she'd decided, in most other ways, to let go. She hadn't thrown it away. She'd turned it around, and then turned it back, and then left it at an angle for a long time. That's not giving up. That's something else entirely. That's the refusal that doesn't quite commit. The version of stopping that keeps one hand on the door. Owen said, "The things you make should go on walls." Marcus said, "Why is it on the floor?" Neither of them was asking about the sketch. 6 months after the board meeting, the Meridian Access Initiative is in development. The Phase 1 site has been selected, a 2-acre parcel in the Central East Side, bought off market through one of the developer conversations that had been at term sheet stage before the board vote. The design process has begun. Marcus has been named Director of Structural Integration, a title that required HR to create a job description from scratch, which they did, working from a specification Serena wrote in 20 minutes at 10:30 on a Thursday evening, while Dr. Park's exercises were posted to the wall above her home desk. Owen comes to the site sometimes on weekends. He wears a hard hat that is too large for him and takes notes in a sketchbook. He has opinions about everything: the sight lines, the lobby flow, the position of the water fountains, which he insists should always be at a height where you can see what's in them. Serena goes to PT every Thursday. She does not walk. Not yet. Possibly not ever. She has stopped calculating the probability. What she does, each week, is try. 1 hour. 1 set of attempts. And the thing in the territory between signal and noise, it has, in the weeks since the first time, become something more locatable. Not reliable. Not conclusive. But there. "Doctor," Park says, "we keep going." She does. On a Tuesday evening in March, Marcus comes off the elevator on 41. There is a small brass plaque near the elevator bank that wasn't there a year ago. He stops and reads it. He always stops and reads it, not because he's forgotten what it says, but because reading it has become a small private act of accounting, a moment of checking the distance between where things were and where they are. Meridian Access Initiative, executive offices established, Voss Meridian Group. He walks down the hall. The light is on in her office, which means she's there, which is where she usually is. He knocks. 1 knock, the same as always. No answer. He waits. He glances through the door, which is standing slightly open, the way it is when she's working on something that has her whole attention. She is at the window. She is standing, not walking, standing. Her hands are on the sill and her weight is forward, distributed carefully, and it is effortful in the way that worthwhile things are effortful, and it is unsteady, and it is unmistakably chosen. She is looking at Portland, at the bridges in their March arrangement, different from November, different from summer. Her own particular version of November that Owen had wanted to capture before the weather changed. She doesn't see him. He watches for 1 second. Then he steps back from the door, quietly, in the way he backs out when she's asleep, or thinking, or in a call that requires the whole room, in the way he has been giving her room since the first night he came in and cleaned the glass by the far wall without asking about it. He walks back down the hall. He starts his evening circuit. The HVAC on the east corridor, the window latches, the Conference A projector, the water dispensers, the lamp cords, the building that he knows by now, the way you know something you have been taking care of for a long time. On his cart, between the supply loops and the maintenance log, 3 drawings are taped. The November bridges in blue crayon, slightly wide-spanned. A photographed copy of the sketch, because Owen had wanted one and Marcus had wanted one too, and a figure labeled "The Lady Who Hung Her Building," standing in front of a window, both arms wide, the building visible behind her on its wall. He does his work. She stands. The building holds them both. The first sound was the click of a pen. Then another. Then 13 folders moved across a polished table in Jeddah, while television cameras held the image and officials behind the principals remained almost completely still. Mark Carney stood beneath the chandeliers of the royal palace, beside Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, watching documents change hands one after another. Commercial agreements, memorandums of understanding, and institutional commitments valued at more than 1 billion Canadian dollars. No American intermediary, no White House permission, no Washington negotiating room. There was no denunciation of the United States, no dramatic announcement that Canada had replaced its largest trading partner, no illusion that a single Gulf visit could erase 2 centuries of continental commerce. There was only a motorcade, a signing ceremony, and a number that carried more weight than its face value: 13. For years, Donald Trump had argued that Canada survived because of the United States. He had said Canada received American generosity, depended on American protection, and possessed fewer alternatives than Canadian leaders wanted their people to believe. The implication was unmistakable. Ottawa could protest, but eventually it would return. It had nowhere else to go. Then Carney returned from the first visit to Saudi Arabia by a Canadian Prime Minister in 26 years with 13 new agreements, a $1 billion commercial package, a 50-megawatt artificial intelligence commitment, and a framework designed to open capital, energy, mining, infrastructure, education, health technology, and defense ties. And behind the entire mission stood 6 words spoken by Carney himself: Canada has what the world wants. Tonight, we reconstruct what those words mean on the surface, what they mean beneath the surface, and why 13 Saudi agreements may represent something more consequential than 13 deals. They may represent the first visible proof that economic pressure can force a country to retreat, or force it to build exits. The stakes are larger than the photographs. Canada and the United States still conducted an estimated $719.5 billion in goods trade during 2025. American companies sold $336 billion in goods to Canada and imported $383 billion in return. Roughly 70% of Canadian exports were still moving south in May 2026. Geography, infrastructure, language, and decades of integrated production cannot be replaced by a royal visit. That is the reality. But dependence is not measured only by volume. It is measured by the absence of alternatives. And Saudi Arabia offered a potential alternative with unusual scale. A $1.8 trillion economy, a sovereign wealth fund valued above $1 trillion, and a Vision 2030 program designed to move capital into mining, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, transportation, health, education, defense, and energy. Saudi Arabia was already Canada's second-largest trading partner in the Middle East. Bilateral trade had exceeded $20 billion since 2020. The relationship had survived a 5-year diplomatic freeze after the 2018 human rights rupture, returned to full diplomatic relations in 2023, and entered 2026 with approximately 600 million Canadian dollars in earlier commercial partnerships announced during a January delegation. Then came July 9. 13 new agreements worth more than 1 billion Canadian dollars. 14 weekly passenger flights permitted for each country. Unlimited weekly cargo services. A foreign investment protection agreement targeted for early 2027. A double taxation negotiation. A permanent Canadian defense attach in Riyadh. 50 megawatts of dedicated artificial intelligence compute capacity. A national presence at the 2028 World Defense Show. Participation in the 6-month Riyadh Expo beginning October 1, 2030. These were not all completed investments. Some were memorandums, some commercial arrangements, some negotiating commitments, and some pathways whose value would depend entirely on execution. But together they created a map. And here is the detail that makes this moment fundamentally different. Trump's pressure was built on the assumption that Canada's dependence was permanent. Carney's answer was built on the proposition that dependence can be reduced one agreement, one customer, and one corridor at a time. The trigger came months before the aircraft landed in Jeddah. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump said Canada received a lot of freebies from the United States. He told the audience that Canada lives because of the United States, and instructed Carney to remember it. The words followed repeated tariff threats, pressure on the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, and claims that Canada might eventually cease to exist as a separate country without American support. Those statements did not sound like ordinary trade negotiation to Canadians. They sounded like a verdict on national viability. Carney's response at Davos was not a tariff schedule. It was a doctrine. He said the old international order was not coming back. He warned that economic integration could be used as a weapon, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He told middle powers that if they were not at the table, they would be on the menu. Then he began building tables. China, Europe, Turkey, the Gulf, defense finance, critical minerals, energy routes, artificial intelligence, new investment forums, new commercial corridors. Saudi Arabia was the most politically difficult of those openings. The kingdom's human rights record remained deeply controversial. The 2018 killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi had generated global condemnation, and Canada's earlier criticism of Saudi treatment of dissidents had led Riyadh to expel the Canadian ambassador, freeze new trade and investment, and recall thousands of Saudi students. The moral tension did not disappear because commercial documents were signed. Carney defended engagement by arguing that lecturing governments from afar was satisfying but ineffective. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said human rights and consular cases were raised. Critics saw compromise. Supporters saw realism. Both reactions reflected a genuine dilemma. Either Canada limited its partnerships to governments that met every Canadian expectation, or it entered difficult rooms to protect Canadian interests while raising disagreements directly. Both choices carried costs. What happened during the signing ceremony was therefore not a clean triumph. It was a calculated decision made in a morally complicated room. Officials from both countries watched the documents move across the table. Business leaders from mining, engineering, infrastructure, health, education, and technology studied the names attached to each page. Cameras recorded the exchange. The room was formal, restrained, almost cold, but the underlying message was hot. Washington had treated Canada's lack of alternatives as leverage. Ottawa was now investing political capital to manufacture alternatives, even where the partnership required discomfort, scrutiny, and risk. No retreat, no surrender, no fantasy. Diversification, and here is the detail that turned 13 signatures into a strategic response. The Saudi package did not concentrate on one commodity. It touched several layers of national power at the same time. The first layer was physical infrastructure. Canadian firms were positioned to support Saudi roads, rail lines, engineering, and Vision 2030 construction. That opened potential work for companies with expertise in project design, resource logistics, and large-scale delivery. The second layer was mining and critical minerals. Canadian companies had already secured the largest share of exploration licenses issued by Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Industry and Mineral Resources. Saudi mineral wealth was estimated at approximately $2.5 trillion across more than 2.1 million square kilometers, with opportunities identified in more than 50 minerals. Canada possessed geological expertise, mining finance, engineering capability, and processing knowledge. Saudi Arabia possessed undeveloped deposits, capital, and political urgency. The third layer was energy. The two governments signed a memorandum covering liquefied natural gas, renewable energy, hydrogen, carbon capture, electricity, cybersecurity, supply chains, and workforce development. Carney also met Saudi Aramco Chief Executive Amin Nasser to discuss deeper cooperation. The fourth layer was technology. Saudi-backed Humane committed at least 50 megawatts of dedicated computing capacity to support Cohere's next generation of foundation models. The deployment was expected to begin operating by the fourth quarter of 2027 and could scale over the following 5 years. BlackBerry and Aramco Digital began discussions on secure communications and industrial technology. The fifth layer was people. Canadian colleges and specialists would support training in construction, skilled trades, medicine, early childhood education, English instruction, and technology. 13 agreements. 5 strategic layers. 1 message. Canada has what the world wants. On the surface, the phrase means Canada possesses resources and expertise that foreign markets need: energy, uranium, potash, minerals, engineering, artificial intelligence, education, financial knowledge, and trusted institutions. Beneath the surface, it means Canada does not approach the world as a petitioner begging to be rescued from Washington. It approaches as a seller with assets, a partner with capabilities, and a country capable of negotiating from value rather than fear. That deeper meaning matters. The Saudi agreements were worth more than 1 billion Canadian dollars, significant, but still tiny beside annual Canada-United States trade. The accomplishment was not replacement. It was direction. Carney also announced a future delegation of Canadian pension funds to Saudi Arabia, participation in Expo 2030, a national pavilion at the World Defense Show in January 2028, and a Canada Saudi Coordination Council led by the 2 foreign ministers. The countries plan to conclude investment protection negotiations by early 2027 and launch a double taxation agreement to reduce friction for workers and investors. This was architecture, not spectacle. A deal can disappear when one project ends. Architecture produces the next deal, then the next, then the next. The anchor phrase now operated on 2 levels. It reassured Canadians that their country possessed bargaining power. It warned Washington that Canadian value was not exclusive to the American market.